intrinsic. It's part of Christianity from the very beginning, in a kind of special way. So, on the left we have St. John's Gospel written in Greek, but what Jesus probably didn't speak Greek. He might have spoken Greek a little bit, but his mother tongue was Aramaic. So it already means the gospel is in a different language from the language which Jesus used. So that means, as I say, that translation is part of the Christian tradition from the very beginning. So we have Greek, and then below that we have Latin, language of Western Europe, mother tongue language of Western Europe. In the middle we have, I assume that's the Quran. The basic point there is that according to Muslims you can't really translate the Quran. You can, but the translation isn't the real thing. The Quran is the only thing which is real. Everything else is something else. It's substandard. On the Buddhist side, so this is a symbol of Lotsawa, the translators of the Buddhist scriptures, and I particularly like these. I need my glasses, but these birds who look in two directions, who are a symbol of the Lotsawa. In fact, there are quite interesting parallels in Buddhism with Christian translation. Sanskrit scholars, Indian scholars, going to Tibet, working with Tibetan native speakers. I do see some parallels there with what the missionaries were doing with local scholars. But nonetheless, this basic point is that translation is the language of religion in Christianity, and there is a theological point, which I will save him from saying. Christianity is about the incarnation of God in a particular culture, which means a particular language, which means incarnation in one culture after another. So that is how Christians understand history. A special thing about translation of the Bible, of course. Here is St. John's Gospel again. And this fellow on the left, or on the right, he's William Tyndale, who is famous in Britain as in England especially. He comes from Western England, not too far from where I come from. The Bible as we have it today has quite a lot of William Tyndale in it. And in fact, this is his translation. But on the left, it's a quotation from a story. He was arguing with some priest who was a conservative priest, and this was the time when the Bible was only available in Latin. And what he is saying is that if God spares me, before I've finished my work, every ploughboy will know more than you do. Every ploughboy will know, because every ploughboy will be able to read the scriptures. So the point about that is that for Protestant Christians in particular, the idea is that everyone should be able to read the Bible, whoever they are. That's true of the Moravians as well. So here is Helmut. And to remind you of the history, your history, Moravian history, Moravia is in the Czech Republic, somewhere over there. The first Moravian Church goes back to 1457. They did translate the Bible into Bohemian, I think, whatever, Czech. In their homeland, they were suppressed. They came as refugees to Germany. I see some analogies there. They came as refugees. I think of Tibetan refugees. I think of other kinds of refugees. As you'll see in a minute, to some degree, there is also a history of Ladakhi refugees. Again, not everybody here knows about the Moravians. So they sent their first missionaries abroad in 1732. One thing that I've only learnt quite recently is that the first ones to study Tibetan were already in the 18th century. There was somebody called Johannes Jenig who went to Russia, to an area where Kalmyk Mongols were, so they were Tibetan Buddhists, and then he went later on to Siberia, his work was not published, but he started working on Tibetan language. So now Moravians in Kielan. That picture was shown at the conference. Here is Kielan. Here is the mission house. Built. Do you want to sit if you can't see it?
No, it's okay.
Built in Western style. And again, to remind you of their history. They set out from Helmut in 1853. They went first to London. They went by ship round Africa to Calcutta. They went up the river Ganges and then by ox cart. They finally got to Kotkar, which is on the Sutlej, 50 miles from Shimla. Where were they going? They were not trying to get to Tibet. They were trying to get to Mongolia. They came here in the summer of 1855. They did go to Pangong Lake, and they weren't able to cross the border. They went down through Spiti, and finding it was impossible to get to Mongolia, it was also impossible to get to Tibet. They asked for permission from the British and from their own authorities to start a mission in Lahul. And from then on, they were always thinking about Lahul, about Ladakh, but they were thinking about Tibet. So it became a Tibet mission. So again, remind you, the Bible is really important, central for their mission, their objectives. And they had a basic question about what kind of Tibetan they should translate the Bible into. So Tibet is a culture with a tradition of literature going back for hundreds of years, but it's quite a technical literature, not necessarily understood by every ploughboy, every ordinary person. So that was one question. The second issue was, we again discussing all the time here, what do we call the language which people speak here? Is it Ladakhi? Is it Rangskat? Is it Palskat? Okay, is it Palskat? Is it Bodik? Is it Boti? Palskat, okay. But the trouble, Ladakhi Palskat is wonderful, but do people understand Ladakhi Palskat in Darjeeling? No, they might understand something. So basically what their strategy was, they decided to translate the Bible into a version of Choskat, a kind of simple classical Tibetan which they hoped would be translated everywhere. In order, that involved, it involved all sorts of things. It involved talking to people and reading and studying. This is Yeshka's own drawing of his study in Kielan. There are lots of little details. I like there's a cat there. There's also a musical instrument. The Moravians were big on music. Actually, I think it's a trumpet and a clarinet, and I don't think that's a harmonium. I'm not quite sure what it is. Actually, that room, it's very typical of a certain kind of German culture. No luxury to it, no carpets, walls painted white, quite austere. And here's Yeshka's desk. He was famous for working late in the night. You would see his candle or whatever it is burning. This is Yeshka's diary, which was written in 7 languages or so. It was the main languages Latin and Greek, but also French, not English, not German, some Danish, some Swedish, and some Polish. The only languages that I could read were French. I'm happy to report he did actually make some mistakes in his French, but nonetheless, French was his 5th or 6th language. Why was he writing in all these languages? Partly for practice, but I think he was also writing because he was opening his heart to his diary and he was complaining about how unhappy he was. He had basically these three bachelors living together, trying to cook for each other, very different personalities, having a miserable time until their wives came. So I understand Ebenezer mentioned that in a sermon recently. The mission board decided that these three bachelors needed to have wives, and therefore arranged for three wives to come. It was an arranged marriage. One of them went to Calcutta to meet them, got married straight away, and then he escorted the others to Kerala. So in his researches, he read books. This is one of them, not the colour illustration, but the life of Milarepa and the 100,000 songs of Milarepa. He refers to this in his dictionary. So MIL is short for Milarepa. That means that's where he found the word. He read medical books. Sangye Gyatso, the Dalai Lama's fifth Dalai Lama's regent, read medical books, astrological books, religious books. He also talked to people. So here we are again in the original visit. Picture, there's these two Ladakis, nice earrings. Jordan and his father. He, again, remember, he wasn't just thinking about Ladakh, he was thinking about the whole of the Tibetan-speaking region. So this fellow is from Sikkim, Darjeeling area. The English called him the Chebu Lama. And here's a reference to him in the dictionary. And this is a monk, I'm trying to remember his name. He was a kind of wandering monk from Tashi Lumpo. In the picture, he doesn't really look like a monk, except he's carrying a rosary. I wonder about the hat. I think the hat looks like a Kulu hat, but it's the wrong way around, somewhat in the way that some lamas wear their hats. So I think it's a kind of adaptation. So he stayed with the mission for, I think, 3 years or so. And again, in the dictionary, it refers to our Tashi Lumpo Lama. So I think this is the Tashi Lumpo Lama. The picture was probably taken at the same occasion as the others. You can see the linen background. From Kelang, he corresponded with scholars all over the world. Here's one of them. He was from Latvia, German-speaking, but based in St. Petersburg, and studying Tibetan from there. One particular reason for mentioning him is that just recently, just this week, I've been looking again at the church library downstairs, and there are some articles by, basically off-prints, by Schiefner. I think they're not only by Schiefner, I think they're from Schiefner. So he sent them to Yeshka and Kelang, and now they found their way here. So his, Yeshka had lots of different contributions, but he, among European scholars, he was the first one to think systematically about different forms of Tibetan, different pronunciations. And here I'm cutting and pasting from an article he wrote just after he went back to Europe. And here he's basically got the same text. He's saying this is how it's pronounced in Ladakh, this is how it's pronounced in the whole. Here's the text. He's saying probably this is the Eastern language, and this is what is Utsang and Lhasa. So he's studying the different translations. He also prepared school textbooks. So here's Kakaga. I was saying just now to David, they used a lithographic press, and the press they used here is still here in the storeroom. Probably hasn't been used for nearly not quite 100 years. Well, probably about 100 years, but it's It's down here. This is an account which he wrote, which was used as a school textbook. When he went back from Kelang, the missionaries talked about Kelang. They talked about Lahore and Ladakh as Tibet, Indian Tibet. So he's talking about it's a kind of travel account about what he saw and heard on his way back to Germany. And here are his dictionaries. This one was written out by hand and printed in Kelang. Here's a Tibetan-German dictionary, and finally the Tibetan-English dictionary and a manuscript version. So that dictionary is still used. Just now I met Becky Norman, who's written this Rangskat dictionary, and she was saying that it's a brilliant dictionary. Among other reasons, it's brilliant because it has a lot of Ladakhi words. It doesn't say Ladakhi words; it says W for Western. All that, the point of all that, was to translate the Bible. So here's John's Gospel. You've seen it in Greek and Latin. Here it is in Tibetan. And two things to emphasize about that. One is the way it is laid out. It is laid out landscape format, like a picture. Later on, he wanted his books to look more or less like Tibetan books. Later on, other translations of the Bible were portrayed. And the other thing which I'm pointing out to everybody is the font. It's a very beautiful font. It was made in Berlin. Yeshker helped design it. The model is probably again a Tibetan manuscript from Siberia, which found its way to Berlin. So since this is informal, maybe I can stop and say at this point, any questions about Yeshka? Sun silence. Okay. So, all right.
How long he stays in Kelang and Western Himalayas?
In the end, not very long. So basically 10 years. And he spent 3 months here when he arrived, and he did also go for a trip to Darjeeling in order to study Lhasa Tibetan.
Haide was already there.
Haide later on went.
He came after SQ. He was before.
So Haide was before. The first two were Haide and Pagal. And to sort of explain, in the end they learned to get on with each other, but they were different sorts of people. Yeshka had been a bachelor schoolmaster. I think he turned 40 just about the time when he arrived in India. He was a scholar. They were typical of a different kind of Moravian. So I think Haida had trained as an apprentice plumber. He wanted to study, but he wasn't able to study because he wasn't rich enough. And Pagal had worked in a marble factory. So they were rather different sorts of people. One reason why they didn't get on is that, again, Yeshka had an idea that missionaries shouldn't be too rich, and he was a bit unhappy about the plans for the mission house. It looked too much like a palace. That was one of the reasons why he went to Ladakh, in order to allow time for a question to go to the mission board, but in order to escape from the building works. So he was a very particular sort of person, very much a scholar, very much a perfectionist, somebody who worked, as I said, really, really hard.
How old were they at the time? How old were they at the time? What was their age approximately?
So when he arrived, as I say, he was more or less 40. And I think the others were maybe late 20s, early 30s. So there was an age difference.
Sarepta first in Russia,
Mhm.
who was also using the Tibetan language before this guy, before this Yunus, yani before him or around that time period, there was another person,
Yeah.
because of which the Mongolia trip was decided.
Okay, so again to build that in, I mentioned so actually they were the first Protestants anywhere to come into contact with Tibetan Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhists, but they weren't Tibetan; they were Mongols. So Sarepta is now part of Volgograd on the river Volga, and at that time, Kalmyk Mongols were there as they're basically nomads. And the Moravians went there 1760s, 1770s. So there's one person I mentioned who's Johannes Jenneker, who is pretty well unknown, who later on went to Siberia and started studying Tibetan. But there's another person who's more famous. He's called Isaac Jacob Schmidt. He was born in Amsterdam, but then went to Russia. Also downstairs, look after your treasures. There is his Tibetan-German dictionary. That dictionary, it was based on the dictionary of Choma de Curus. Choma de Curus was a Hungarian who came here to Ladakh and then to Zanskar. He prepared a Tibetan English dictionary. Isaac Jacob Schmidt is pretty closely based on it, and there is some of his own work, but Choma's is the main one.
So, according to history, Choma the Chorus is the first person who made the attempt to translate into English with Ladakh.
Choma?
Yeah. If you go back into like time.
Yes, except that he wasn't. So again, on this point of language, Choma's dictionary isn't Palskat.
Yeah.
It's Joskat.
Joskat.
Although in some places he gives a pronunciation, and the pronunciation is Western. It's not Lhasa.
So he was made to spend those 3 years with a monk in Zangla.
That's right.
So that's where he got like whatever he learned, right?
Yeah. So both these people were brilliant. So Choma started with almost nothing. He did have a book written in the 18th century by an Italian monk. He met an Englishman, Moorcroft, I think in Dras. So Choma was Hungarian. He's a Hungarian hero. He walked all the way from Hungary. His mission was to discover where the Hungarians came from. They came from somewhere in the east, and he was looking for their origins. He met William Moorcroft, who was quite well known here in Ladakh, and Moorcroft encouraged him to study Tibetan, and so he did. And indeed, he went to Zangla, and his teacher was Sangye Pudzog, who was quite a famous monk. There's a sort of difference. Choma had one particular teacher, whereas Yeshka didn't have just one teacher. Yeshka had several informants. Yeshka admired Choma's work, but we can say he took it has a broader range of sources, including particularly the spoken language.
So another question was, I recently learned that initial from Czech, Bohemia and Moravia, Moravian, they came and obviously reached south of India, and most of their missions were based in Tamil Nadu and south of India. Correct me if I'm wrong. But then, and because of disease, so many of the missionaries died. I don't know what the reasons of the illnesses. And then, why did they divert the attention to the Himalayas? Was this something like decided there in the churches, or how did they actually what was the motive to climb up in the Himalayas?
All right. I mean, the 18th and the early 19th century, the Moravians themselves went everywhere, Persia as well, Algeria, and I think. Now I'm trying to remember. I think one or two did go to Calcutta, but there were other missionaries. So I think there were Danish missionaries in the Tranquebar Islands. There were German Lutherans who were quite famous in Tamil Nadu. there were other missionaries in the Himalayas. So remember I said they stayed in Kotkar. They actually stayed with German missionaries working for the Church Missionary Society. Earlier in eastern side, again, there was another German missionary working for Church Missionary Society, not so well known, who also studied Tibetan between 1816 and 1822, 1820, and then died young. So already by this period, especially by the 1850s, there were a number of missionaries becoming useful. Becoming active already in 1854. Before the Moravians came, there was a missionary called Robert Clark. I think he was also Church Missionary Society, and he came here to lay. So why did they decide to climb mountains? Well, as I say, they were on their way to Mongolia. They didn't really know where they were going. Why were they on their way to Mongolia? There was a German missionary called Gutzlaff, who specialized in China, and he went on a kind of tour of Europe to various missionary societies saying, come to China. And the Moravians thought, well, we know about Mongolians, so we will go to the Chinese Mongolians. And we can't go via the Chinese coast, and we can't go via Russia, so we should go via India. And now it seems a little bit crazy because we know a bit more about geography, but actually not entirely crazy. I have heard that some Mongolians, Hor, find their way. Actually, the Hor are Turkestan people, but who knows? Some Mongolians find their way here.
And Robert Clark, he made something about that? Or nothing? Because I never heard this.
He wrote a book in which there's a chapter on the Dach, and he also wrote quite a long series of articles in the Church Missionary magazine. And if you go into the bazaar and you buy my edited volume of the Daching Histories,
Oh yes, I have this.
yeah. Okay. So in that chapter, he appears in that. Okay. Good. Asking questions is helpful. So moving on. So this picture, I guess this sort of rounds off. So earlier you saw Haida where his beard was black, and now his beard is grey. Here is his wife Maria, and actually just recently I've been having correspondence with Aaron and with various other people trying to, and with David, in fact, I think trying to work out who is who. I'm reasonably sure that this is Samuel Jordan looking rather older. One of these is Dana, and I think it's that one. I am confident this is Zotba. Maybe this is a Dana. So I'm not quite sure about everybody, but basically this is Kielan 1890s.
And the other one with the TP, we don't know. Standing.
The little one.
Yeah.
The baby
No,
born.
this one. You know it or no?
I think he's Dana, so one of David's ancestors.
Okay.
I don't know if you can see a family resemblance. Do you think this is?
Baby.
Or maybe this is Dabazon. Is that possible? Do you think that one's Dabazon? It's a famous picture. It appears in lots of places. Also, in fact, in that book. So to say something about Haider, I told you he couldn't study. He wanted to study. He read everything he could. I can send you a copy of it.
Okay, that's nice.
But he was particularly a farmer. He built up the he built up the Kielang Mission Farm. I guess over time he became a scholar of Tibetan. So he left. And also about Maria. So Maria, there's a German language novel about him, not translated into English, but it's called Hochzeit in Tibet, Marriage in Tibet, and it's about her experiences. She has a diary which you can read on the internet if you read German. It's in some ways it's a little bit heartbreaking because a lot of it is about her children. And there's one particular episode where one of her children is sick. She's waiting for the doctor to arrive. The doctor is, in fact, Dr. Cayley, who was the first British official to spend the summer here. She's waiting for the doctor to arrive. The doctor does arrive, but the child dies anyway. So not all her children died. Another thing which is also heartbreaking is that when they got to a certain age, they had to go back to Germany, and then their parents might not see them for decades. When they did go back to Germany in 1904, they were hoping to meet their daughter, but no, they were too late. But they did meet two sons, and she lived on until sometime in the First World War, I think 1916 or 1917. So she should definitely figure in Ebenezer's sermon. She was a very resilient, faithful person, very loving, very supportive. And I guess again, the point of your sermon is that the Moravian, the congregation is built on people like that, the women as well as the men, and these women as well as those men. And indeed, that's true. In fact, on that topic, this is a little bit off topic. One of the less famous missionaries who was here was F.A. Peter, who passed away in 1988. I sent him something that I'd written just before he died, and he wrote a very nice letter back. And one of the things, again, he said is that I should have said more about the women. Okay, I take the point. So and continuing with the Bible translation, what happened was Yeshka's translation was everybody, even now, they say it's good, but there were some printing mistakes. The other thing is that people in the Darjeeling side said it was too Western. It had too much of a Ladakhi aspect to it. And so they formed a committee which met in Gumne, Darjeeling. They brought out a revised edition of the New Testament. The Moravians never really liked it. They thought it was a kind of compromise, but it's the one that was widely used. It's still widely used. It's sometimes called the Shanghai version because a later edition was printed in Shanghai. So now let's come to Ladakh. Here I wrote an article about this postcard in Stawa. It must be one of the first postcards of Ladakh, but it wasn't sent by a tourist in Ladakh. It was sent by somebody in Germany to somebody else in Germany. So the Moravians printed these postcards as a kind of advertising material. And yes, I noticed that the school says established in 1887, although I thought I helped establish it in 1980, but anyway, never mind. The first Moravian school indeed was about 1887, and evidently this was the building, so not as big as today. And here are two children. On the left is somebody called Ali, who later went on to live in Kotkar, and on the right is Joseph Gergen, both of whom were brought up as orphans. Tanit Ali, who contributed to the newspaper. Last night, I hope you're listening, I was asked a question about Jor Punsog. Jor Punsog. Last night you were asking about Jor Punsog, so here he is, called Paulo Jor Punsog, and this is a less famous missionary called Becca Shore, who didn't stay very long. Jor Punsog was the first lay Christian to be baptized in lay. So the people who were baptized in the Hole were from Ladakh, but baptized in the Hole. He's from Ladakh, but baptized in Ladakh.
In which year, do you know?
1894. And I don't know, I vaguely imagine that is somewhere up towards Shankar or so now here's somebody who is much better known, and you may even know that picture. It's Frank and his wife Dora. I say something about the women. She was a very good linguist. Helped her husband translate the Kaisersaga into German. Downstairs there is a little pamphlet of something else she translated from Tibetan. But she was unhealthy. She had to go back and live in Germany, which was later why he did. Here are the children. Tallest one was called August Hermann, like his father. The second one was called Walter Siegfried Dondup. And the youngest one was Hilde Deskit. So they had Ladakhi names as well as German names. I met Hilde Deskit. In 1995, we had a conference in Bonn, and she was still alive then, in her 90s. And some of the congregation may know Martin Klingner, or may know of Martin Klingner, because he's never been here. He's Franker's grandson. So to bring Franker into the story, he was a younger successor to Jeschke and Heide. He didn't have a university degree. He'd been trained as a primary school teacher. He was really interested in languages. He had already started studying Sanskrit before he came. There's a minority language in Germany, a Slavic language. He'd studied that. He studied English. And he followed Jeschke because he wanted the Bible to be translated into Troskat. But he was also very interested in the spoken language. So in order to study the spoken language, he collected oral literature. Oral literature means folk songs, folk stories, Kaisersaga, oral history. And here are some of the people he worked with. So these are his drawings. Mehmet Setan lived in Kalatse, and in 1902 or 1904, as a very young man, he remembered the Dogra invasion in the 1930s. So Franker collected his memoirs. Ishi Rigzin, Franker employed him as the schoolmaster. He was one of the only literate people in Kalatse. So he never became a Christian, but he worked very closely with Franker, writing stories down. And Chompol is the great-grandfather of Samson. His story is that he also came from central Tibet on a pilgrimage to Triloknath, and he got sick, and he was left behind by his friends. Gar Punsog, who is the ancestor of various people, Galden and Abhishek, and because everybody intermarries, he's probably the ancestor of other people too, looked after him, and he became a Christian, and he became an evangelist working with Franker in Kalatse. There's a nice story here that Franker was working with Chompol to study some historic Tibetan texts which came from Central Asia, and he started reading the first line, and then without looking at the text he completed and recited the rest of the text. So this was a text which he had learnt by heart as a monk. I think it was a 14th or 15th century text or something. Here's Konchoktashi. So he is the person who told Franker the Kaisersaga. He also told other folk stories. So on the right, that's a kind of pamphlet which is printed here, probably actually here, maybe in the mission compound. On this lithographic press, I don't know for certain, but that is probably Samuel Jordan's handwriting, and it was used as a school textbook. And that's a picture by Franklin. So again, the significance of this is that it's Ladakhi literature, oral literature. It had never been written down. Now he's writing it down for a new purpose, for teaching people to read at schools. Here, maybe I should, I'm not going to hand over to Rigton, but here, Rigton's special topic. Would you like to? So this is Franca's monthly newspaper. It's called the Ladakhi Akbar. Why Akbar? We were asked about this at the conference. Urdu Arabic Persian word meaning news. This is in Uchen script, but his Umed, and the basic language I understand is Falskat. So the strategy, he's trying to get people to read different sorts of things. Historically, the written word was really important for Tibetan culture, but people associated it mainly, not only, but particularly with religious texts. He wanted people to read other things, stories, news, news in particular. He hoped if they did begin to read other things, then they would read other things, including, for example, Bible stories. Somebody was saying, you've been saying, I'm still not quite sure, but the Jammu Kashmir government did not encourage newspapers. At the very least, if you were starting a newspaper, you were meant to apply for a license, and the Moravians didn't. And so I think they had to shut it down at least briefly, and then maybe finally as well. And one more thing on the subject of Palskat. So again, the main effort was about continuing to translate the Bible into Choskat, but they did also produce a Palskat version of the Ladakhi St. Mark. Franca did the first version, and then Joseph Gegund revised it. I've got a bit more to say, but again, maybe pause there. Any thoughts, any questions? When Franca, the last time Franca came here was in 1914, which was very bad timing. He came from Kashgar, from Turkestan, and when he was still in Turkestan, Xinjiang, he met Italian Professor De Filippi, who told him that war had broken out in Europe, but he wasn't sure who. Basically, he thought that England and Germany were friends, and therefore he thought they were on the same side. And it was only when he got to Leh that he found out that wasn't true. He was a little bit innocent because he thought, well, I'm a missionary. He'd worked for the Indian government, he'd worked for the Archaeological Survey, and he thought he would be allowed to continue. But actually he was sent to an internment camp in Ahmednagar, and in 1916 he was sent back home. His adventures continued because then he himself was looking after Indian prisoners of war in Romania. Apparently it was quite a comfortable life because they were away from the war front and well looked after. And then finally he was again imprisoned himself in Serbia. After the war, he basically had no money, but he took up the work of Bible translation, and he did get money from British and Foreign Bible Society. Germany at that time had terrible inflation. You could have a banknote which says 10 million marks. I almost feel nostalgic. The British currency is going down right now, but at that time it was very high. And Martin Kling, his grandson, said that this money helped him survive and helped him buy good furniture. Anyway, so here he is now. This is Professor Hermann Franke in Berlin. Antiquities of India Tibet. I hope you can buy that in the bazaar. It's one of his most important works. So he was living in Berlin. By the mid-20s, he was actually quite prosperous, very respected, Herr Professor. But he was still in communication with Joseph Gergen in Kielan. And again, I'm hoping you can help me with this picture. Here's Abisunken.
Yeah, that's a listen.
Here is Galpuntur. This is Zotba. Of course, Joseph Gergen and Abi Denzin. We were discussing last night. Do you think that is Gapa? Maybe. And one maybe Zotba, and I don't know who that is. So that's about, I don't know, 1924. That's a picture in the British Library. Small, and that's basically the congregation, a pretty small congregation. Joseph Gergen was busy, so busy with textbooks. So here's Class 3 Primary. And the texts, again, they're folk stories. So I think Aesop is there. But he was continuing to correspond with Franke about his researches, but also about Bible translation. So Old Testament Bible translation. Franco wrote the first draft. Joseph Gergen rewrote it. And then it was sent to David MacDonald and Babu Tarchin, who was in Kalimpong. Babu Tarchin was brought up as a Moravian, lived in Kalimpong, and was the editor of this famous newspaper from 1927 to 1963. And here's another group photograph. Yeah, that one which you see. So this is Richard Peter, Joseph Gergen, Stanton Razu, who some of you remember. SS Gergen. This is Chibet Gergen, who died in 1929, so it must have been sometime before that. And I'm not sure, David seemed to recognize a few of the others.
It's a black and white print.
Okay, again, I can share that picture. Again, it's outside that church, just there. So now, very briefly, I'll summarize what I was talking about at the conference, but I won't give you the whole thing. You'll be glad to hear that. Some of you may know, but maybe not. In 1933, Rahosan Krichayan, who's a famous Indian intellectual, with Setan Punchok, Aliya Setan Punchok, before he was Aliya, they published a set of textbooks. And very briefly, the background was in 1932-31, there were some riots in Kashmir and in Jammu. There was a commission of inquiry led by somebody called Glancy, and the Buddhist community isn't the Ladakhi Buddhist community, it's the Kashmir Raj Bodhi Mahasabha. So it basically is Kashmir Pandits speaking on behalf of the Ladakhis, saying the Ladakhis don't have proper textbooks. This one is significant because this is the first time I've seen the word Bodhi in print. So Bodhi, where does it come from? It comes from Bod, Tibet. But it seems it's a geographical term, but it's also a religious term. And as I say, this is the first time I've seen it used. So here's Rahul. Rahul at that time was a Buddhist monk ordained in Sri Lanka. Earlier he'd been an Arya Samaji and he'd been a Congress Party activist. Known at Setan Punchok, still a Buddhist from Sabu, still in his 20s. He'd already spent time as a monk in Rizal Monastery. Now he was in government service. And in July 1933, they formed, we would now say, an NGO, a civil society movement, the Dark Buddhist Education Society, led by the king, one of the Kalons, I guess, as vice president, Setan Puntsog. This fellow is a teacher, Skazang Shrai, I guess, same family as Tonyo Shah. I don't know who they are. And here are their textbooks. So this is quite a hybrid. These are a Tibetan reader and a Tibetan grammar, published in Calcutta by the Baptist Mission Press, which was the best press for Tibetan font, on behalf of the Mahabodhi Society, and using Yeshka's font. And here's the introduction. So I always give this as a test question. What is interesting about that text? I think you know the answers. So for the rest of you, what's interesting about that text?
Well, it's French.
It's French. Have you seen any other Tibetan texts like that?
It has gaps in between, the sentences.
And
After every sentence, there's a gap.
Well, after every word is a gap.
Yeah.
Huge gap here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there is.
So
Yeah,
and
so it's not continuous like.
Yeah, it's not
Yeah.
continuous.
Yeah, it's not continuous.
So the words are separated in the same way as European languages or modern Hindi.
Also, it's easy to read.
Easy to read. Easy. Yeah. Good. Thank you. So it is easy to read, and a friend of mine who taught Tibetan in London to Imchi, to foreigners. So he started writing Tibetan like that for beginners, and he was rather proud of his achievement. But I think this comes from Rahul rather than Setan Puntsog. So indeed, it is easy to read, and the textbooks were designed to be easy to read, which I think was their main innovation. I understand that the way people learned Tibetan in monasteries, basically they started with complicated texts straight away rather than starting with beginner's text, and they learned it by heart. That's one way of learning, but this is a more graduated approach. It contained all sorts of things. It contained Aesop's fable, but also poems written. So here's a poem by Setan Puntsog in honor of Mother. Yeah, I mean, just to summarize, those books were in use until the early 60s, and then there've been a succession of different ones. I gather Yeshi Dundup wrote the next series, Jamyang Gyatsen and Teshirag the other ones, and there are especially more recent ones. So I mean, in a way, this is part of Buddhist history, because Setan Puntsog was still a Buddhist. But it is also part of Christian history because Joseph Gergen also contributed to the textbook and gave guidance, and the textbooks borrowed the format from Joseph Gergen's textbook. So there is a direct relationship between them. Okay, any questions on that?
And why they stopped to do textbook with words, separated words? Because now, all the textbook, it's again,
Continuous sentence. Sentence is continuous,
Yeah.
There's no gap in between.
no more gap.
So basically, conservatism won.
Yeah.
I think it was considered to be a bit strange. I mean, since then, not just my friend Tsering Gonkatsang, but there's a lady called Tsering Deki, living in America, Tibetan lady, and she has a very interesting blog, and she wrote an article she called it aerated Tibetan. So her argument is that if people are going to, if children are going to study Tibetan, it needs to be fun and it needs to be easy, and this could be helpful. But I think it's still seen as a rather crazy idea.
Yeah, it's like to change the orthograph, like Bettina, Bettina, Bettina.
Yeah. Okay, so I've got to my hour, more than my hour. I got to my hour, so I do have some further things to say, but fewer pictures, no, actually more pictures. Wanting to be, everybody likes crowd photographs, so this is a mission conference in 1974. And the Batapa family is represented, I think that's Tashi Batapa. Joseph Gagan, of course. I think that's Division. And this is Norman Driver, I think that's Chompel, who you saw before, and that's Fred Peter, who is his son. He looks very respectable. Again, I mean, since I am talking about the Bible, so to continue, what happened with the Bible was it was finished in 1934. The Bible Society didn't print it. Joseph Gagan, on his own initiative, redid the New Testament. And then in the mid-40s, Joseph was getting old and frail, and so a group of people said to the Bible Society, let's hurry up. So Joseph worked hard on preparing proofs. That was, so to speak, a family occupation. Here's Joseph Gagan's family, SS Gagan, Seton Butsog, and some of these people, Yorpal, Abby Sunken, not Abby in this picture. They worked very hard on preparing the text. It had to be printed, I'm sure many of you know the story, it had to be printed in Lahore. It had to be printed in Lahore in 1948, which was not a good year. And the problem was that they needed somebody to correct the proofs. And so, here again, making sure families are included. Gapal, again, we were talking about him last night. He went to Lahore, David and Daniel, went to Lahore in 1948, even though India and Pakistan were at war, but somehow they weren't completely at war. The story is that it was so hot in Lahore that he had to sit in a room under ice. I dare say that's true. But in the end, they did produce. Here is the 1948 Bible from the library downstairs. It's in 4 people's handwriting, and I'm trying to work who the 4 people are. I think it's Gapal, his brother Zotpal, Eliza Sugden, who used to live in Shea, and Seton Punso. So this was I guess the culmination of nearly a century. It still wasn't the end of the story, because people in the Darjeeling side said it had Joseph was a Ladakhi, it was too Ladakhi. And therefore there was another revised revision produced by Seton Punso and a Swiss missionary, Pierre Vitos. And even now there are some missionaries producing Gospels in Lhasa Palskat, Amdo Palskat, Kamba Palskat. Still with the pictures, that's 1943, so back in history. In Delhi, I by chance met Jonathan Padra. I said I couldn't recognize everybody. I couldn't recognize that person, but in fact it was him. Apparently that's Jonathan Padra. It doesn't look like that now. And there's Razu Joseph, of course. Is that Debuson? I think. And I can't remember who the other.
That's Tashi Paljo. That's the one at the back, standing in the center. That's my great grandfather.
Your grandfather?
Great grandfather.
Great grandfather.
Jonathan's father.
Oh, Tashi Paljo.
Yeah.
Tashi Paljo.
Okay. And that's Kashipataka.
Tashi Pataka.
Yeah.
That's a
Who's the one with the cap like with his
hat.
I think it's, is it Turchin? Turchin Jordan? Turchin Jordan was famous for wearing this fez. And
The hat, the one with the hat is?
that's Joseph Gavin.
The hat, round hand.
And that one,
Yeah.
that's Rosa.
Maybe Razu.
Museum Gate in Sydney.
with Michelle with glasses.
I haven't got to 2 hours, but that's my final slide. Yes, who are these people?
Who are these people? Let's speak.
Yeah, we should recognize them.
Okay, so that's my that's what I've prepared, but happy to discuss. Espal wants me to write up something readable about the Tibetan Bible, so I will try and do that. I've also written but not finished a paper on the mission farm or the economic side of things. Oh, in the industrial school here. So plenty to do. Please help me if you have any interesting stories. Last night we were discussing about the weather station. If you find photographs or letters,
The geographic.
meteorological. Okay, so that's it. Any questions, thoughts, comments?
I'm more interested in the personal exchanges that missionaries had with their families, and what they used to write back and stuff, because they were here for and on their own and all that. So is there any place or anything documentary or something that you can help me with, where, because whatever they did as a mission and what they were doing here is something else which is documented, which people can read, but what is personal is something what I'm interested in, like in terms of basically you kind of get to know about the place and culture, economy, everything from a person's account to what he writes to his family or something.
Yeah.
Impressions, first impressions stuff.
I recently saw a comment which said, of course, we look at different sources. You look at printed reports, you look at letters, and you look at diaries. And somebody said the usefulness of the source is in inverse proportion to the audience. So something which is printed for a wide audience, there's a lot of censorship. A letter to the mission board, less censorship. Personal diary, then maybe you tell the truth, or a family diary. So letters keep turning up. Maybe 2 examples. There's one which is in English, and I actually brought a copy and gave one to Ebenezer. You have one. It's a book written by the family of some missionaries who were here around the time of the First World War, and it is a very personal book about their experiences. There's another recent example in Germany. I'm sorry, it's in German, but I can tell you what it says. That in itself is a rather remarkable story. It's letters home from a German missionary. The letters were, I think they were destroyed when an old lady died. But somebody picked them up out of the dustbin and transcribed them. And then a museum in Munich found the typescript in a flea market and made a very nice book about it. And again, it's the women's view, writing about her impressions, very jolly. Children come into both those stories, keeping the children healthy. It's not a book for. Oh, and there are lots of nice details. They talk about they had a Christmas tree at Christmas. The Kashmiri Wazir came to give them presents and congratulate them. So indeed, you get a different view from that. There are still a few here. 2014, the daughter of the last Swiss missionary came here, Tessal. She said that her mother had said the only reason why her babies were still alive was because they had a cat who kept them warm in winter. Ladakhi children can survive than European children can survive. Anyway. Any other?
I had a question about the stories. So you were talking about Aesop's fables. I mean, I studied in Dehradun, so I remember reading the English versions of few of the stories. But then when it comes to Ladakh, I think once we had a chat with Mumsha about how there are many Ladakhi stories which people think are Ladakhi, but they're actually German stories. So can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, okay, so and that's for you to research. So future research. So I mean, it's clear the missionaries found not just the missionaries, and Joseph Gilpin and others. So these types of stories appeared in the newspapers and in the school textbooks. Aesop himself is quite complicated. Aesop is Greek, but some of those stories are older than him. So some of those stories may be Indian stories, Asian stories. Sort of example of the same thing, in Joseph Gergen's textbook there is a story about, and I'm forgetting the name, but it's basically a story about sounds a bit spooky, a corpse, a dead body who recounts stories. I'm seeing some nods there. Apparently there are parallels, direct parallels between this Sanskrit version of the story and the Tibetan version of the story. So basically what that means is that some stories, well, it means two things. One is people like the same sort of stories, and it also means that some of the variations of the stories were in several different countries. Another example, in Europe, there are stories about the clever fox. And there are in Ladakh stories about the stories of the clever fox. So sometimes it's hard to tell where they came from. But I could imagine that some of these stories might have come from the school textbooks into popular culture, just like people think that Ladakhi socks are Ladakhi socks, whereas they're not, they're European socks.
So being from a photography background, I'm quite curious and interested about, is this just a selection of images that you wanted to show to us where we can reflect on our future, on our past and ancestors, or is that the missionaries who just, like, they were just focused on mission and just the church compound and the school area that,
And I wanted you to see your ancestors, so I had more group pictures than I otherwise would have done. Their selection of pictures, different purposes. So the first missionary to use pictures systematically was that fellow with Joe Punso. I guess he learned the skills, and the pictures he sent home were not just about the mission. They were pictures of Ladakh, pictures of Churton, pictures of houses, pictures of the bazaar, to give people in Europe an idea about what life was like. Again, their selection is interesting. One thing I didn't point out, the very first picture, actually I can't point it out, yeah, that picture. So this picture, here are the missionaries and their very first converts. But this fellow is holding a prayer wheel. So what's he holding a prayer wheel if he's a Christian? I'm not quite sure how to express it, but it's again, this is intended for an international audience, and maybe they're adding a kind of exotic flavour to make it look interesting. So I guess, well, behind your question, and it's really true, and Rigson can add to that, all sorts of conscious and unconscious thoughts go into my selection, but also into their selection.
Excuse me, sir. You said that 15 July 1933, for the first time, the Raul Sanskriti and Southern Punto, they had like composed the textbook of school. And my question is that, so before 1933, there is no any textbook for the school students?
No, yes, so there were, and indeed that was my part of my point. So, I mean, several of them. So, and these were the textbooks used in Moravian schools, but you can see they're printed in the same kind of press, and the quality is not so good. And they were used in Moravian schools. I don't think they were used in government schools. So maybe in the government schools, I don't know whether they did have textbooks. Quite possibly not. In fact, I think probably not. For today, we hear. Goodness me, I'm hearing that even today about government schools here. Not enough textbooks to go around.
Also, I remember.
Like you say, so if there is what to say, if there is no available of the textbook before them, so how the like ancient people who are like gone before them the time, so from where they have read them.
Well, you
There
write
were
on
no
street.
books. There were no. So when the school started, actually, any idea of when the government school started? The government school were the first schools.
Well, our school, I can say our school, mission school, we say 1887, and the Wazir ordered parents to send children to the school. It implies there were no schools, government schools then. I think there was a Sanskrit school before that in the 1860s and 1870s. In Lahore, the government specifically asked the Moravians to start a school. That was in the 1860s. So they were, in a way, they were the government school. They were sponsored by the government. I think school enrollment in the Moravians. So the textbooks I've been able to find, again downstairs, they're up to class 1, 2, 3, 4. But I don't think they went beyond that. You had to go to the Bisco school. And the lay middle school. So Seton Punso went to the lay middle school. What his family says is that after that he was self-taught in Tibet. And Joseph gave it as well.
I was told by my aunt that our great grandfather, he knew Sanskrit. Perhaps he was sent somewhere. He was sent somewhere outside India.
Okay, I'm looking doubtful, but it is possible. So not there was not Joseph Dana, but the one before that. It's possible they did know Sanskrit because there was a school. So just now we are worried. Some people are worried about saffronization. There was an earlier example of saffronization after the Dogras came. They tried to teach Ladakis Sanskrit and they gave them Hindu names. I think that was about the 1860s, 1870s. And so maybe he was at that school. Is that what that means?
Yeah, then he went to Manali. He went to Shillong.
Well, there and then he might.
Anyway, I have something to share.
It's okay.
As I say, I put the group photographs hoping you would find your answers.
Jolly